Smartabase and the architecture and how we're organizing all of our data within the system. So all data systems essentially have an architecture behind them. So how information data is coming in, how it is organized at the cloud level, transformed to be able to use into manageable pieces, and then how we visualize it in the form of a graph, a table, or a simple report, or even how we extract this information for deep analysis in another product like a Power BI or an R or something outside of the actual system. So in a nutshell, here's the basic architecture of how all of our information is organized and used within Smartabase. So over here on the left-hand side, we have different buckets of information that's coming in a couple different ways. Okay, so this information we'll call data can be entered manually from an app or a group entry from a coach. It can be entered automatically from an integration via API from a software like a Catapult. But essentially, we take all that information, we bring it into the cloud. That's how it's brought into Smartabase. And then that's the storage location. All of our information, all of our data is stored at the cloud level on Smartabase in their servers. Once it's in that point, we can work to manipulate that data or transform that data into manageable chunks of information. What I mean by that is we can look at the last 21 days, the last 6 months, or all history. We can start to run calculations on certain things. So let's just take, if I have, maybe like a bench press. Let's say we're bench press maxing and we use repetition maxes. I can take my weight that I did on the bar. I can take the reps that I did at the specific weight, and I can run a calculation at the cloud level and transform that data to give me a calculated field, which is the estimated max. At this level, once I have it in the cloud, I can basically do anything that I need to speed it up. So I don't have to calculate information on the back end. I want to put raw data in from data sources, put it in the cloud, and then transform it there. That's not only going to speed things up and keep things really clean, it's going to allow me to do a lot of other things, and it's going to give me more options when I get to the next step. The next step being to visualize and use that information. The really attractive method when you get to visualization is we all want fancy bar graphs, charts, tables that show everything. But the key point at this stage is we want to be simple. Okay, we want to have a specific question we're trying to answer, and we want to manufacture our visual, our graph, our report to answer that specific question. That's what the visualization step is all about, is answering questions and taking your data from the raw data step to actionable information that I can make decisions upon. So let's look first at the different areas of information or data that how we can bring it into the system and what types of data we can bring in. So for this purpose, we've broken it into 5 categories. I mean, we can bucket this into some different categories even further, or we can scale it down a little smaller. But for the purpose of explanation of data entry, I think it's beneficial to look at it in 5 different ways. Intake entry, we'll think about that as once an athlete has a new profile created and they're just coming into the Penn State system. Athlete entry, the athlete is actually entering information into the system. Staff entry, a staff member, a coach, an intern is entering information about an athlete or a situation into the system. We have data input entry, and that could be where I'm taking existing information that I already have, maybe in a CSV or a spreadsheet, and dropping it into the system. And then finally, our integrations, which are just basically automatic feeds that come in from our various softwares that we use. So let's first look at what we'll call our intake entry. So as soon as a student athlete is onboarded onto campus, they're going to go through a process of medical onboarding. Okay, during the medical onboarding process, this is where all insurance information comes in, full name, date of birth, all your things that are going to be identifiable information for that athlete. Within this process too, all previous injury history, illnesses that have been with the athlete over time will be collected. And it's going to be stored, if you remember from some of our past videos, very protected with only certain individuals having permission to view that data. But it's going to go into this intake entry. This point is going to be completed by computer entry. Okay, so the medical provider for the given sport will create a profile for the athlete, and then the athlete will have the ability to download the app and then fill out a quick survey via an intake form on the phone app. That then goes against their record on their individual profile in athlete details. Okay, this step here, and I'm only breaking it into the intake entry because it's the beginning of a new profile in the system. This pretty much is completed one time during an athlete's career. Once there's a profile, once there's initial information there, they don't have to keep coming back to this. But this step is important because it does designate a new user in the system. Different users, like super users in the system, can go in and adjust things. Let's say there was an error. Let's say an athlete changed sports per se or had something else. We can edit the athlete details, but this intake entry is going to occur when they first come in, and that's going to be completed via computer and the phone app. The next one is athlete entry. Okay, so now our athlete is integrated into a team. He or she is participating on a day-to-day basis. And at this point, they may be using different surveys like RPE, rating of perceived exertion. So how difficult the training session was on a given day. We may be pushing that survey to them after a training session. We may be asking them to fill out their health check or a wellness questionnaire. That could be pushed to them with a push notification that we've talked about in the past on the smartphone app. It could also be done in one of our weight room venues on the kiosk. So we have kiosks in every single weight room, and all it has to do is athlete pulls up his or her name, and then they input that entry. This athlete entry is basically essentially an event form. So if I click my name, Josh Nelson, and I fill out an event form and hit submit, that record goes against my record in the system and timestamps it on that specific date in time. Okay, so this entry point is essentially just one portal that information is coming into the system, just like the one previous with our intake entry. The next one would be staff entry. Okay, so athlete entry, staff entry, they're going to have some similarities in the entry points, but it could be done slightly different once you get to the staff entry. Our staff are going to have the ability to input data for multiple athletes, whereas the athlete entry will only have access to enter data against their personal records. Staff entries can take place across multiple athletes. So essentially the athletes that the staff member is responsible for. So if I'm working with the tennis program and I need to input multiple data points for my entire roster, I can put it in as a group entry. So we've talked about that in a previous video as well. But basically, staff entry is essentially just another event form, and I have the ability to put data in against a lot of different athletes' profiles. The next one, data input style of data entry. This is basically where, let's say I have pre-existing data. It could be historical data that I have. Maybe it's context data on weather that I want to apply to specific training sessions for an athlete. Maybe it's a massive set of performance testing data that I have for clean data, bench data, squat data, 40 data, whatever it may be. Let's say I have it in a spreadsheet. I can create a template form in Smartabase, download that CSV or that template, put my spreadsheet data into the template, and then upload that template into Smartabase. And what that then does is it applies those columns, those data points to the specific athlete in the system. Now at this point too, there is the point where we may need to map athletes. For example, my name is Josh, but my given name is Joshua. So in one case, if I'm entering as Joshua and on this spreadsheet, I'm listed as Josh, the computer and the system does not recognize that that is the same person. So there may be an instance where I need to map the two together, then that data will sync there. no problem. It doesn't have to be done routinely, but that's a really big point on why all of our information needs to be consistent across platforms, is it allows the ease of mapping athletes. But data entry is allowing us to put pre-existing data into the system really smoothly. The last point is our integration process. Okay, so an integration is essentially an API, which is a connector between a third-party system and Smartabase. I'll use, for example, Catapult or ForceDex. All these different systems have an integration, which is a link between the clouds on the two different companies. So I have Catapult Cloud here, Smartabase Cloud here. So as soon as I upload data into Catapult Cloud, it makes a connection and pushes that data against each individual athlete's record for that specific date. Now, the neat thing about the API integrations is it happens automatically. So as soon as I sync Catapult to the cloud, within a small period of time, it's going to go over there. Now, the point of caution, though, is the information that I push to the cloud on Catapult needs to be very accurate, because there's going to be a push pretty soon. I need to make sure that everything that I'm putting in there is really accurate. Same thing with ForceDex. If I have athletes that maybe that would cheat a rep or something that doesn't look right in the system, I need to buff that information out and clean that data before it pushes to the cloud, because it will push straight to Catapult. Integrations are going to be huge for us, especially as we onboard new systems. The back end of an integration or an API, it's essentially an event form in itself. An event form is simply just a small entry point. So basically what it's doing is taking Catapult data for each individual athlete and dumping that information into a spreadsheet or an event form in the system, and then pairing up the individual rows with each individual athlete or each individual period, and then putting that information against the individual athlete's record for that specific time and date. So integrations are really powerful because it's automatic and it takes a step out of the process of us having to manually enter that information. So after we have those different sets, just like I talked about in the intro, we already brought it to the cloud. When I talk about the cloud, that is Smartabase. A cloud storage system like Smartabase allows us to have so many different options, because now I have the ability to safely store that information. I have the ability to control who has access to that information, and it allows me to have the ability to scale that information out much easier than if it was stored locally. Take, for example, if I have a group of information data that's on my local computer, or even a shared drive, a Dropbox, there's limitations there because you have to create access points for people to have access to that information. And there's certainly ways that we can work around this. And we currently do that in our old system. But the problem with that is when you have too many people that have access to raw data, there is the ability to accidentally have a mistake or have an error occur with deletion of data, of mismanagement of what's happening with our raw data. So when we push the information to the cloud, it's safely stored, and we can control who has access to that with our permissions, which we talked about in the past. And then more people can use the information. More people can share that information with key decision makers, and more people can take and use the overall system. Once the information is in the cloud, just like I mentioned at the beginning, we can take and transform this data, run calculations. We can adjust the information for time frames that I may need to look at, which will be huge for load times over time. And I can do a lot with transforming. And then finally, the last step is just visualizing. And when we think about visualizing, just think about creating something that I can use to make decisions. It's a really simple architecture. We just have to be able to manage what event forms we're building. We have to be able to manage the quality of information that we're putting into the event forms. And then we all have to have the ability to quickly go to the visualization step to be able to use that information for our decision making. In a nutshell, looking at the data architecture of Smartabase, very simple. It's going to be routinely repeatable over time. The more people that we have understand this simple process, and we will continue to move forward with this series. Data architecture with our Smartabase system.